September 1945, Yokohama POW camp, Japan. Louis Zamperini lies on a wooden board that serves as his bed. He weighs 97 pounds. Before the war, he weighed 160. The war ended a week ago. He heard rumors, whispers from guards. Hope passed between prisoners in the dark. But rumors meant nothing in a place where men still carried rifles and prisoners still died of starvation. Then he hears it, the sound that had meant terror. For 4 years, aircraft engines. His first instinct is to hide. After years of Allied bombing raids, that sound meant death, fire falling from the sky, the earth shaking, running for cover that didn't exist. But this time, something is different. The planes are flying too low, too slow. Louis crawls to the compound wall and looks up through the chain-link fence. A B-29 Superfortress, the same aircraft that firebombed Tokyo, the same silver giant that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, is making a low pass directly over the camp. Its bomb bay doors open. Louis braces for the end. Instead, barrels tumble out. White parachutes blossom against the grey sky. Grates the size of coffins crash into the compound. One smashes through the latrine roof, 10 feet from where he stands. The impact shaking the ground beneath him. The Americans have come to save him. But first, they might accidentally kill him. This is the story of Operation Swift Mercy, the most dangerous rescue mission you've never heard of. Louis Zamperini was one of the lucky ones. He was still alive. Across the Pacific, in 775 camps scattered from the frozen mines of Manchuria to the jungles of Singapore, over 12,000 American prisoners of war waited in the aftermath of Japan's surrender. Some had been captive since December 1941, nearly 4 years of systematic starvation, forced labor, and disease. Of the 27,000 Americans captured by the Japanese during the war, 40% were already dead. 11,000 men, they didn't die in combat. They died slowly, starved, worked to death in coal mines and on railroad construction, or succumbed to diseases that could have been easily treated. Those who survived to hear the news of surrender faced a cruel paradox. They were free in name only. Allied ground forces were still hundreds of miles away, fighting through the last pockets of Japanese resistance, or staging for invasions that would never come. Supply lines across the vast Pacific didn't exist yet, and every day that passed, men who had endured years of hell were dying in the supposed peace. Marine Private Lionel Berthaud had been captured at Corregidor in May 1942. He'd survived 44 months as a prisoner. When liberation finally came, he weighed 80 pounds, half of what he'd weighed as a healthy Marine, half his body weight gone. He was free, and he was dying. For these men, Japan's surrender on September 2nd was just another rumor in a long line of lies. The Japanese guards told them America had lost the war, that their families believed them dead, that no one was coming, and for weeks after the surrender was signed, it looked like the guards might be right. Allied command faced an impossible question. How do you find 775 camps spread across millions of square miles? How do you supply 12,000 dying men when you don't even know where they all are? And most urgently, how do you do it fast enough that liberation doesn't become just another way to die? The answer would require turning the weapons of war into instruments of mercy, and it would cost lives. The U.S. Army Air Forces had one tool that could reach these men in time: the bomber fleet. B-17, flying fortresses, and B-29 Superfortresses, aircraft that had spent years raining destruction on Japanese cities, would now deliver salvation. But first, they needed to find the camps. Operation Birdcage began on August 27th, 2 weeks after Japan announced its surrender. Reconnaissance planes flew low over suspected camp locations, dropping thousands of leaflets. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Stay in your camps. Help is coming. For men who had been systematically lied to for years, it was impossible to believe. At Yokohama, Louis Zamperini watched the leaflets flutter down like snow. He picked one up with shaking hands. The words were in English, real English, not the broken propaganda the guards had shown them. But he'd seen false hope before, watched men cling to rumors that destroyed them when they proved untrue. Then the planes came back, lower this time. So low he could see the pilots in the cockpits waving. So low he could see the white stars on the wings, clear and unmistakable. American planes, American pilots. The first real proof that the world hadn't forgotten them. Around him, prisoners who could barely stand were jumping, shouting, weeping. 4 years of despair, cracking open to let in a sliver of hope. But Louis understood something the jubilant men around him didn't yet grasp. He'd been a bombardier before he was shot down. He knew these planes. He knew what came out of bomb bays when they opened.
Relief?
Heavy things, falling from altitude. Those planes were coming back with supplies. Drums of food, crates of medicine, hundreds of pounds of material, dropped from the sky into a camp with no proper drop zones, no cleared areas. Just wooden barracks and prisoners too weak to run. The liberators were coming, and they were about to bomb the POWs with food. On August 30th, 3 days after the leaflet drops, the first supply missions launched. Hundreds of B-29s and B-17s. Their bomb bays loaded not with incendiaries or high explosives, but with 50-gallon drums of food, crates of medicine, bundles of clothing. Each drum weighed hundreds of pounds. Each crate, if it hit you, would kill you as surely as any bomb. The pilots received one instruction: fly low enough to be accurate. Drop everything you have and pray the parachutes deploy. What could possibly go wrong? At Yokohama, Louis Zamperini heard the engines before he saw the planes. Then the sky filled with silver, B-29s flying at 500 feet, so low he could see the rivets on their fuselages. Bomb bays hanging open like the bellies of metal whales, barrels tumbled out. Some had parachutes that opened with a crack of silk. Some didn't. The POWs scattered in chaos, a desperate mixture of hope and terror, running toward falling supplies and away from them simultaneously. A 50-gallon drum packed with shoes slammed through the roof of the latrine. Inside, it crushed one man's leg. Another prisoner trying to catch a falling crate took it square in the chest. His skull fractured. He would survive, but barely. A crate of medicine, precious medicine meant to save lives, crashed into the compound at terminal velocity, missing Louis by 10 feet. The wooden box exploded on impact, scattering vials and bandages across the mud. This was salvation and chaos in equal measure. Across the Pacific, similar scenes played out at every camp the bombers could find. At a Mori camp near Tokyo, a parachute failed to deploy. The crate killed 2 prisoners instantly, men who had survived years of captivity, killed by American generosity in the moment of liberation. At a camp in Manchuria, a drum of flour split open in midair, covering prisoners in white powder. They looked like ghosts, laughing and weeping, covered in food they hadn't seen in years. But the prisoners learned fast. Within days, POW camps transformed into organized operations. Men who had survived through sheer ingenuity turned that same resourcefulness to directing their own salvation. They painted giant PW letters on rooftops with anything they could find. White lime stolen from guards, bed sheets tied together, even their own clothing laid out in patterns visible from thousands of feet up. They cleared drop zones, moved the sick and wounded to the perimeter, created massive bullseyes in the center of compounds. Drop here, not there. Some prisoners made semaphore signals with whatever materials they could scavenge, directing planes like ground controllers at an airfield. At Yokohama, Louis helped paint a massive white circle in the compound's center. For the first time in 4 years, he had some control over his own fate. Not much, but some. And when the supplies landed inside the target zones, when parachutes drifted down exactly where they were supposed to, it was like Christmas in hell. Staff Sergeant Frederick Spakal watched crates split open, spilling food he hadn't seen in years. Chocolate bars, canned meat, cigarettes, coffee, medicine, actual clothing, not rags, but clean shirts and pants that fit. The parachutes themselves became treasures. Men who had nothing turned white silk into blankets, bandages, and flags. One prisoner at Omori camp carefully stitched together an American flag from parachute material. With shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, he raised it over the camp for the first time in 4 years. Old Glory. Made from the same parachutes that had delivered their salvation, Louis Zamperini stood in the compound at Yokohama, eating his first chocolate bar in 4 years, watching silver birds circle overhead like protective angels. He was surrounded by scattered drums of supplies, by wounded men struck by falling crates, by starving prisoners weeping with relief, too overwhelmed to speak. It was dangerous. It was chaotic. It was imperfect. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. But for the airmen flying these missions, the danger was far greater than anyone on the ground knew. Flying a fully loaded B-29 at 500 feet over mountainous terrain is an unnatural act. These aircraft were designed to fly at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and enemy fire can't reach. To drop their payloads from altitude, give the bombs time to fall, and be safely away before impact. Flying low and slow with bomb bays open turned them into lumbering targets for every wind shear, every downdraft, every mechanical failure that at high altitude would be manageable. At 500 feet, there is no margin for error. The Pacific theater was vast. Some camps were deep in Manchuria, hundreds of miles behind what had been enemy lines. Others were on remote islands with no airfields, no navigation aids, no weather stations to warn of storms. Pilots flew without GPS, without ground radar, often in weather conditions that would have grounded all flights in peacetime. And they were tired, exhausted. These crews had flown combat missions for months, sometimes years. They'd survived the war. They could have waited for safer methods, for ships to arrive, for official repatriation procedures to be established. But the men on the ground were dying. Not from enemy action, not in combat, from starvation and disease in the supposed peace. So they flew. On September 3rd, a B-29 carrying medical supplies to a camp in Korea went down in bad weather. The entire crew, 11 men, died on impact. The war had been over for 2 days. On September 7th, a B-17 flying a mercy mission to Manchuria lost an engine over open ocean. The pilot tried to make it back to base. The plane went down 50 miles from the coast. No survivors. On September 12th, a B-29 carrying food to a camp outside Nagasaki flew into a mountain it never saw through the clouds. 8 airmen killed instantly. Between August 30th and September 20th, 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's formal surrender, 77 American airmen died during Operation Swift Mercy. 77 men who had survived the war, who had flown missions over Tokyo, faced fighter planes and anti-aircraft fire, and made it through to see victory. They died after the peace was signed. They died on missions of pure compassion, trying to save men they had never met and never would. Each pilot who climbed into a B-29 for a supply drop knew the risks. They'd watched planes go down. They'd heard the reports. They knew that flying low-altitude missions over unfamiliar terrain in uncertain weather was one of the most dangerous things they could do. They flew anyway, nearly 1,000 sorties in 3 weeks. Some pilots flew multiple missions a day, pushing their aircraft and themselves past exhaustion. Because every day they didn't fly was another day prisoners died. 4,500 tons of supplies delivered. Food, medicine, clothing, hope, and 77 lives spent to deliver it. At Yokohama, Louis Zamperini watched the planes come every morning like clockwork. Silver birds appearing through the clouds, circling, dropping their mercy and disappearing again. He never knew their names, never knew that some of them wouldn't make it back to base, never knew that men were dying to keep him alive. All he knew was that every morning, without fail, the planes returned, and every morning, hope fell from the sky. By mid-September, the impossible had been accomplished. The U.S. Army Air Forces had located nearly all 775 camps. They dropped supplies to over 12,000 prisoners across millions of square miles of Pacific territory. They'd established radio contact with Allied ground forces, coordinating the beginning of formal evacuations. More importantly, They'd done it fast enough. Men who had been days from death were gaining weight. Dysentery was being treated with the medicine from the drops. Infected wounds that would have killed were being cleaned and bandaged.
In the distance,
the death rate in the camps, which had been climbing even after surrender, began to fall. Marine Sergeant Rufus Baker Austin had been one of the first American POWs of the war, captured when Wake Island fell in December 1941. He'd survived 370 days of captivity, nearly 4 years of systematic brutality. On September 8th, days after the supply drops began at his camp, he managed to get a letter to his mother in Pennsylvania. His handwriting was shaky, the words sometimes difficult to read. But the message was clear. Dear Mom, our planes are dropping us supplies now. Food, clothing, medicine, everything we need. If we stay here much longer, we won't even look like ex-war prisoners. Our good old planes sure do look good coming over. He paused, perhaps thinking about what to say next. How to communicate 4 years of horror and hope in a few lines that censors might read, that his mother's heart might not be able to bear. Finally, he wrote the only thing that mattered. Mom, it's great to be an American. For men like Austin, like Louis Zamperini, like Private Berthaud, the supply drops weren't just about food and medicine. They were proof that their country hadn't forgotten them, that 4 years and thousands of miles meant nothing when it came to bringing their boys home, that America would fly through dangerous skies, risk lives already saved by peace, and move heaven and earth to honor its promise. You will not be left behind. In late September, Navy ships finally reached the major camps. The formal evacuations began, a slower, safer process than the emergency airdrops, but one only possible because the drops had kept men alive long enough to rescue Louis. Zamperini walked up the gangplank of a hospital ship in Yokohama Harbor on September 23rd. He weighed 105 pounds. He'd gained 8 pounds in 3 weeks, most of it from the supplies dropped by B-29s. Under his arm, he carried a white silk parachute carefully folded. It had drifted down with a drum of food, and he'd claimed it before anyone else could. He would keep it for the rest of his long life, a reminder of the day salvation fell from the sky. As the ship pulled away from Japan, Louis stood on deck and watched the coastline disappear. Somewhere inland, American planes were still flying mercy missions to the remaining camps, still risking everything to bring home men who thought they'd been forgotten. Operation Swift Mercy officially ended on September 20th, 1945. Though some supply missions continued into early October as the last remote camps were located. In total, 1,066 sorties flown, 4,070 tons of supplies dropped, 77 airmen killed, over 12,000 prisoners sustained until rescue. It doesn't appear in most history books. There were no medals of honor awarded for these missions, no monuments built, no victory parades, but for 12,000 men, it was the most important operation of the entire war. It was the mission that brought them home. The Second World War officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But for the men who flew Operation Swift Mercy, the war didn't end until every last prisoner was accounted for. Until every man who could be saved was brought home. They understood something that gets lost in the grand narratives of victory and defeat. Wars are not won just by destroying the enemy. They're won by bringing your people home, by proving that the nation they fought for will move mountains to honor that sacrifice. The bomber crews who flew those missions, especially the 77 who died, understood something else. Too, that victory isn't just about conquest. It's about compassion. The same B-29 Superfortresses that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki also dropped food on Yokohama and Singapore. The same aircraft that firebombed Tokyo also brought medicine to camps across Japan. It's a contradiction that defines the moral complexity of war itself. The instruments of apocalyptic destruction, repurposed for mercy. Louis Zamperini would later say that August 30th, 1945, the day he saw those first supply parachutes falling, was the day he truly believed he would survive. Not just physically survive, but emotionally survive. The day he knew he could go home and rebuild a life. Because those parachutes meant someone cared enough to risk everything to save him. 79 years later, Operation Swift Mercy remains largely forgotten. It's overshadowed by D-Day, Midway, Iwo Jima, the battles we remember, the victories we celebrate. But for thousands of families who got their fathers, sons, and brothers back in the autumn of 1945, Swift Mercy was the only operation that mattered. It was the promise kept, the debt honored, the proof that America means it when we say, we will leave no one behind, even if we have to drop food bombs to prove it. In 1998, over 50 years after the war, a group of former POWs gathered in San Antonio, Texas. They'd been trying for decades to get official recognition for the airmen who flew the Mercy missions, particularly the 77 who died. Louis Zamperini was there. So was Rufus Austin. So were dozens of other men who had stood in prison compounds in September 1945, watching silver wings appear through the clouds. They each brought something with them, pieces of white silk parachute, carefully preserved for half a century. Remnants of the mercy that fell from the sky when they needed it most. Together, they sewed those fragments into a single flag, a banner made from dozens of parachutes, from dozens of camps, carried home by dozens of men who never forgot. That flag hangs today in the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, a monument made not of marble or bronze, but of silk and memory. A reminder that in the darkest moments, hope can fall from the sky, and that sometimes the last battle of a war is the most important one of all.